Hello and welcome to Louis Sinclair Investigates. A while ago I came across a truly fascinating story that could certainly benefit from a proper investigation. At the heart of it is a simple computer, but a computer that seemingly acted as a kind of message hub for communications through time. From medieval England with threats, blackmail and betrayal, and from warring entities in the future able to control reality. And, caught in the middle, some unlucky folk in the present who did nothing more than borrow a computer with no idea of what they were getting into. The vertical plane, their account of the so-called Dodleston mysteries, is quite intriguing. I'll put a link to it in the description. But at about 350 pages, dense pages, it does sometimes feel like a jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the box to help us. And my job today, after studying it intensely for over a year with the help of expert linguists, scientists and paranormal researchers, is to show you that picture, the full picture, and in depth. And although most of the reviews on YouTube and the internet dismiss the story as nothing more than a hoax, I'm not entirely convinced, because though we will look closely at the possibility of a hoax, either fooling the authors or by the authors fooling us, we've noticed evidence that's been overlooked, cryptic clues, including ones hidden in the messages, that are so compelling that they seem to shine a completely different light on the whole story, raising questions like, is it possible that we're looking at future entities running an extraordinary experiment with time, manipulating it, conflating the past, the present and the future, and then using the modern-day folk as guinea pigs to be messed with, and their reactions observed and recorded? Or are we dealing with extraterrestrials figuring out how intelligent or gullible us sentient inhabitants of Earth are for some hidden reasons? And were either of these also using their communications to give us warnings, with examples, about our mistakenly thinking that knowledge is the same as wisdom, a blindness that could bring about the end of humanity itself? Or were they nothing more than just malicious poltergeists, having fun at the modern-day folks' expense? And so that you too can spot the clues, I'll present that full picture, including, seemingly for the first time ever, revealing a secret code hidden in plain sight about the meaning of the Dodleston mysteries. So first the story, and then in the final 3 episodes, like detectives, we'll gather those clues and see what conclusions we can draw. So let's take a look. Cheshire, a charming English county, famed for its glorious rolling countryside of gentle hills and checkerboard fields, its fine Tudor mansions like the magnificent Little Morton Hall, and, in some ways appropriate to the bizarre story we're about to investigate, the birthplace of Lewis Carroll and his mad, mad world of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with its grinning Cheshire cat. But, as we'll see, Ken Webster, a young resident of Cheshire and a respected economics teacher, certainly wasn't grinning after borrowing a computer from his school, the highly regarded Harden High School, one of the oldest schools in Wales and founded in 1606. What he saw on the screen changed his life and potentially challenges our understanding of time and how it might be manipulated, for good or for ill. Ken lived at Meadow Cottage in the ancient village of Dodleston. The cottage was built in the 1700s, replacing the original building that had been burnt to the ground about 200 years earlier, following beliefs that its occupant was communicating with devils through a mysterious box of lights, or as we know it, a computer. Our story begins in late autumn 1984. Ken had invited his girlfriend, Debbie Oakes, a bright and sensitive young lady, to move in and help with renovating the cottage. And one day footprints, each with 6 toes, were seen on one of the recently plastered walls. Thinking they were nothing more than dusty smudges from the renovations, Debbie painted them over. But the next morning the footprints were back, and bizarrely tins of cat food, shopping that they'd left unpacked, were found neatly piled on the kitchen table. "Ah, just a ghost with 12 toes and a serious case of OCD," joked Ken. "Nothing to worry about." How wrong he was. In December 1984, Nicola Bagley, a close friend, had come to stay with them for a while. She had ambitions of being a writer, and so, to help her, Ken borrowed a BBC Micro Model B from the school, plus a monochrome green monitor, a printer, and a 5¼ inch floppy disk drive. The Beeb, as it was affectionately known, was a marvel of its time. Let me just pop on an anti-static glove and we'll have a look at mine. Switch it off first, remove the top case, shift the keyboard. We can see that a Beeb has what's known as open architecture, where users were encouraged to expand its functionality by inserting EEPROM chips that were loaded with programs, like this one, Edword, a word processor. Let's put it into this empty slot. Make sure the pins are straight. Now gently rocking it into place. And there we are, a new program installed. Pop it back together. Switch it on. And fire up our new chip, our new program. So, star, Edword, press return, and we get to the menu. Type C for create, give the new document a name, so H will do, press return. And there we are, a blank word processing document. Now let's return to the prompt screen. Of course it's primitive by modern standards with our user-friendly icons and drop-down menus. For example, although starting up Edword, like we've done, is pretty simple, all the commands and formatting, bold, margins, save, print and so on, has to be done with codes that we just have to remember. But Nick was delighted, fired up Edword and started to do some writing, occasionally having to consult the manual for those user-slightly unfriendly commands. One Sunday evening, Ken, Debbie and Nick decided to visit a friend, and when they returned 3 hours later, Nick went to the computer, which she left on, and found a file that she didn't recognise. Ken, Deb, Nick, true are the nightmares of a person that fears, safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get out your bricks! Pussycat, pussycat went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer, L.W. What on earth was that? And where had it come from? How did the author know their names? And apart from the fortune cookie platitudes and bits of children's rhymes, what was meant by get out your bricks? Was this some kind of threat? By the way, this strange phrase, get out your bricks, in shouty capitals, is actually our very first cryptic clue, planted there deliberately by someone or something to give us a hint about the true meaning of the Dodleston mysteries, and we'll investigate it closely in the conclusions. Anyway, unsettled by the mysterious message, Ken returned the computer to the school. Late December. Christmas was drawing near, and Nick left to spend the holidays with her family. She was particularly glad to do so, as the previous day they'd noticed sudden drops in temperature in Meadow Cottage, along with inexplicable gusts of wind, and had found more items stacked on the kitchen table. Debbie, though a little concerned, was fascinated by these goings-on, as she'd long been interested in matters paranormal. By early February 1985, Nick had returned, and so that she could carry on with her writing, Ken borrowed another BBC Micro. The Red Lion, a charming pub or tavern in Dodleston, still thriving and popular amongst locals and visitors, was a favourite haunt of theirs. One frosty night they'd gone there for fish, chips and a drink or two, warming themselves in front of an open log fire. After returning, Nick noticed another unfamiliar file, seemingly and rather bizarrely written in medieval English. I'll show you the original, and, like the others that follow, I'll translate verbally, word for word where possible, so you can easily follow and understand the ancient text.
What strange words you speak! You are a noble man who has a beautiful woman who live in my house. I have seen many alterations. It is a decorous place, with lights which the devil makes, and costly things that only my friend Edmund Grey can afford, or the king himself. It was a great crime to have stolen my house. L.W.
Someone had evidently broken into the cottage while they were away, and had left this strange, rather threatening message. Someone who seemingly had overheard their conversations. The message suggested that Ken had somehow stolen the author's house. Perhaps that's what "get out your bricks" had meant in that first message. Get out of my house. Very odd. At school, the senior English teacher, Peter Trinder, looked at the printout, said that the text was in Middle English, and though he agreed it was just a hoax, asked to see any other messages that might appear. 9th of February 1985. A friend, John Cummins, visited the cottage and suggested that they reply to the message and see what happened. So they wrote to L.W., asking some questions, including when he'd lived at the cottage, the name of the reigning king, and who was his friend Edmund Grey. Next day, a reply.
Edmund Grey, brother of John Grey, lives at Kinnerton Hall. The king, of course, is Henry VIII, who is 46. Signed, L.W. 28 March of the year 1521.
1521? Well, that was a bit of a shock. Anyway, after Ken had read the printout to John Cummins over the phone, he went back to the computer, but the file had disappeared. In the school staff room next day, he handed a copy to Peter. Rubbish, said Peter. As a local historian, he knew that Kinnerton Hall, shown here with its superb 3 Dutch gables, hadn't been built until 1685, over 100 years later. Furthermore, if Henry VIII was 46, 6 and 40, then because the king had been born in 1491, the date should have been 1537, not 1521 as in the message. Obviously, this led them to think that the whole thing was just a fraud by someone who couldn't even be bothered to check the facts. Though, to be fair, there was a question mark after Kinnerton Hall and after the date 1521. By adding these question marks, was this mysterious L.W. dropping some kind of hint? Curious to see if they noticed the errors and how they'd react. But why would he do that? 16th of February. More things had been stacked up in the kitchen, and on the computer screen a new message. In it, L.W. said about his farmhouse, it has red sandstone footings, possibly to prove that he was telling the truth, something they could check. And most important of all, he signed off not as L.W., but as Lukas. Now, Meadow Cottage did have red sandstone footings, but that didn't actually prove anything. During the renovations, the ancient foundations, dating from Lukas's time, had been partially excavated and left outside, so anyone could have seen them, including a potential hoaxer. A couple of days later, Ken and a friend were playing drums and guitar in the living room. Debbie joined in on her saxophone. And that evening, another message came through from Lukas. He addressed Ken as,
My good friend,
and said,
My writing machine is a wonderful thing, somewhat unnatural.
Adding,
Your merrymaking pleases me, but it is somewhat annoying at times.
And asked,
Will you tell your woman to play more of her flute thing? It is a beautiful sound, I think.
And signed off with his full name.
Lukas Wainman.
Now, obviously, this raised a serious question. Who had been listening to their merrymaking? Was there a stalker in the village trying to freak them out? Or if they really were communicating with someone from the distant past, what was this writing machine? The first writing machines, typewriters, weren't around until the 1800s. Anyway, the school needed Ken's writing machine back, so he returned it, though kept the floppy disk containing the messages, and decided to visit nearby Chester Library. He wanted to see if he could find any mention of Lukas Wainman, Edmund Grey, and possibly an older Kinnerton Hall. The librarian said that coincidentally someone else had been inquiring about old Dodleston too. The hoaxer, perhaps? But as regards the information, Ken drew a blank, so returned home none the wiser. 21st of February. Ken and Debbie visited their friend, John Cummins. He'd just bought Colin Wilson's book, Poltergeist, and wondered if they were being visited by these mischievous or sometimes malicious entities, particularly as he'd found out that 2 ley lines, energy highways, passed directly through Dodleston village. In his book, Colin Wilson said that Poltergeists are thought to feed upon anxieties, which sometimes they themselves cause. And certainly Ken and Debbie were concerned about what was going on. Wilson also wrote that he'd had reports of poltergeists transmitting writings from long-dead people, usually through automatic writing, but also as marks on walls, but in messages on computers. A week later, following heightened poltergeist activity, if that was what it was, including items moving in their presence when their backs were turned, Debbie's initial fascination turned to anxiety, and so, with Ken's help, moved out, renting a house in neighbouring East Green. They hadn't split up, she just needed a break, though Ken, understandably, was beginning to worry that the disruption could be threatening their relationship. He returned home to find something very concerning. The floppy disk containing Lukas's messages had been moved from the windowsill to the kitchen table. Was Lukas hinting that he wanted the computer to be brought back so they could carry on chatting? And if so, how had he moved the disk? Travelling through time as well? One way to find out. Ken borrowed another beeb and wrote to Lukas, but very politely, because if Lukas had moved that disk, then seemingly he was able to materialise in their time. Not necessarily a good thought. 2nd of March 1985. At the beginning of Lukas's next message, he protested,
"Have I not been friendly with you? And yet, unless I'm mistaken, I think there is not enough trust."
How had Lukas picked up on Ken's concerns? But then Lukas softened, adding,
"Nor do I have an explanation for why you be in my house. But you are a noble visitor, and you may stay as long as you like. My servant thinks that you be all in my head. He also says that my blood be poisoned, and that it be my weak-hinged imagination. But lunatic I am not, I think, and he must keep it secret till I write my book. I have had some mishaps with your device, but it does amuse."
What was this device? Though it was outrageous to think so, did Lukas, nearly 450 years earlier, also have a BBC micro? He called the device a Leem's Boist, literally translated as light's box, perhaps referring to the beeb's LEDs, or perhaps an illuminated display, a monitor maybe. And what book was he writing? Was he making notes on his experiences with them? Ken had written to Lukas about modern times, including mentioning cars. Lukas thought he was joking and said,
"I think you jest when you talk about your horseless cart, Tiger. It's good that we can be relaxed and joke like this."
Playing along with him, Ken cut out a magazine photograph of a Jaguar XJ Coupe and left it on the monitor. And the next day he found the photograph still there, but partly burnt, and on the computer a message that read,
"My good friend, I have found the portrayal of your cart, but it is a crude thing, for without your horse it shall not go far."
Lukas then gave details of his education and the books he'd studied, something that Ken could check. Lukas confided that, though he'd been happy moving to Cheshire,
"Now things have changed, for my undesirable King Sheriff does plague me so. I think he is here every turn of my glass."
Or every hour.
"My King Sheriff is Tom Foulhurst."
Although Lukas had said this almost as an afterthought, Ken was concerned, and he was right. Ultimately, the sheriff's involvement would affect the rest of their brief time together. It was Peter who delivered the blow. Increasingly, Ken had come to believe that Lukas was real, particularly when he mentioned his understandable confusion with the device, the computer, presumably. But the college that Lukas claimed to have attended, Jesus College, Oxford, hadn't actually been built until after the death of the supposedly reigning King Henry VIII. So yes, said Peter, it was just a badly researched hoax. But Ken still wasn't sure, so just wrote, "Thank you." Earlier, Lukas had said that he'd felt there wasn't enough trust being shown to him. But presumably, under the stress of the sheriff's involvement, it was now he who felt no trust for them.
"My friend, pray what strange demon are you? I am so confused. You are, I think, a noble man, but your lies terrify me much. I have no wish to accuse you, but you said also that you are a learned man, but you do not mention my misspelt words. If you were alive, you would say you know not of my Jesus College.
So had Lukas been testing them, as before, seeing if they spotted the deliberate mistakes? Then he ended,
It is not I that makes you afraid. It is you that makes myself afraid.
To Lukas, Ken's ignorance showed that they were the hoaxers, devilish hoaxers, not he. Lukas went on to say that he'd actually attended Brasenose College, Oxford, to become a priest at the university, and, as proof, gave them details of an inscription above the college fireplace. By the way, you may have noticed my wedding ring. I'll show you a close-up without the hand wrinkles. It's a medieval priest ring made from cast iron. Iron was thought to protect the wearer against evil spirits, and Lukas, following his studies, would certainly have worn something very like it. 11th of March. Anyway, not knowing what to write, they waited, and eventually another message came through demanding to know who their friend Peter was. That night, the poltergeist activity got worse and worse. They needed help. So Peter suggested that they contact the highly respected Society for Psychical Research. A week later, Debbie was alone in the cottage, warming herself by the fire. She heard tapping noises from the kitchen. Suddenly she felt a prickly coldness. Her hair being tugged, her shoulder gripped, and sensed the shadowy presence of a man nearby. Terrified, she ran outside into the pouring rain and waited for Ken to come home. And, on his return, she said that she'd leave permanently if anything like that happened again. Their relationship was at its lowest ebb. Ken wrote back to Lukas, saying that Peter was a close friend who'd be visiting soon and, like Lukas, had attended an Oxford college. Perhaps that alma mater connection would give Lukas some reassurance. 31st of March. Debbie had the shock of her life. Lukas appeared to her through some kind of time portal, perhaps. She was reading Colin Wilson's book Poltergeist. A flash of white light, a pulse of surging incandescent green, and a man appeared, poorly dressed and petrified. He looked around. Nothing was familiar. Then he saw her, tried to speak, but no sound came from him. And later that evening, Lukas wrote,
I did see a fair maid,
and that
it did so frighten me to see her suddenly appear.
1st of April 1985. Being a practical-minded chap, Peter decided to drive over 150 miles to Brasenose College to check out Lukas's description of the wording above the fireplace, and also to see if anyone called Wayneman had attended in the early 1500s. He discovered that the foundation stone, with its inscription, was above the stairs, not over the fireplace, as Lukas had said. However, the librarian, Robin Peedle, couldn't find any mention anywhere of a medieval student called Wayneman. But, intrigued by Peter's story about Lukas, he promised to do some more research. One evening, a few days later, Peter pointed out the error about the inscription's location to Lukas, who, early next morning, replied,
I did make a mistake about the words placed above the fireplace. It is my poor memory. The words are above the first stairs.
He then quoted them accurately, apart from a few minor bits that he couldn't clearly remember. Again, I'll translate. In the year of Christ, 1509, and Henry VIII's first year, in the name of God, Lincoln the Bishop and also Sutton laid this stone in agreement with the authority of the King, 1st day of June. Now, a hoaxer wishing to cover his tracks could have travelled to Oxford to copy down the correct inscription or visit the college library, but overnight, a 320-mile round trip. That's an extremely determined hoaxer. Or perhaps something very different was going on, and only someone with a specialised knowledge of highly complex medieval abbreviations could have made sense of it, which brings us back inevitably to Lukas. Certainly none of the 1980s folk would have had a clue what was written there. 10th of April. Lukas had visited a friend in nearby Stockport, a fellow student of religion, who'd warned him about mentioning his connection with what was to them the distant future. He wrote,
"He advised me well. He said that I must not tell a soul of this unknown world and of your people, or else it be nothing less than a capital offence."
A death sentence, in other words, for witchcraft. Lukas said that his friend would visit him soon to see this box of lights for himself, though strangely he now referred to the Liemsboist as a commuter, seemingly copying the word computer as used by Ken and the others. But why would he be making this curious spelling mistake? It does rather look like a deliberate attempt by a hoaxer to make the messages seem more authentic. Or were the messages getting scrambled, or deliberately altered in some way? 3 days later, the whole mood of the story changed abruptly. Debbie had been reading up about the heavy-handed justice of the early Tudor period, and was telling Ken about it. Torture was commonly used to extract pleas from an uncooperative suspect, where heavier and heavier stones were placed upon their chest until either they confessed or suffocated. It was known as pain forte et dur, pain or punishment strong and hard. Next morning Lukas sent a message betraying his deep anxiety.
"Did I hear you speak of the dreadful pain forte et dur? Why is this? Do you mean to tell the Crown?"
Presumably Lukas was scared that they were going to betray him to the authorities and bring about his execution for witchcraft. Debbie swiftly wrote to reassure him, but she and Ken were far from reassured. This meant that Lukas could definitely overhear their conversations, and of course that would explain how he'd known to correct his errors about the inscription and its location. 16th of April. Lukas's friend arrived and wrote to them. He obviously struggled with the Beeb initially. We'll be taking a closer look at this garbage typing later, but then got the hang of it, saying,
"You are a phantom of great powers. It is my theory that you are to come,"
meaning they came from the future, and
"the fashion of our time be that I will not give my nor Lucas Wainman's true description and name."
So Lukas was not his real name. Little wonder that they couldn't trace him. And it's certainly true that in those days it was commonly thought that the devil could only take a person's soul if he knew their birth name. 19th of April, but now things went wrong. Very wrong. The sheriff had informed the authorities about Lukas's box of lights and his suspicions that Lukas was involved in witchcraft. Lukas's friend, obviously very upset, wrote,
"You are a foolish devil who has brought nothing less than darkness upon the wretch,"
meaning Lukas.
"I hope he comes not to harm, otherwise I guarantee your death by my own hand somehow. It was unavoidable with your magic lights, and now he sits in a dungeon of shame. It will be your ruin unless you help Lukas, for he shall not die if you show yourself to the Crown for what you are and display your powers of devilry. Then his life will be spared."
Ken, Debbie and Peter were horrified. Overt threats and Lukas in prison facing certain death. Ken immediately replied, asking for Lukas's real name. There was a chance that this time they might be able to locate it in the records and even discover Lukas's fate, or, if it were possible to change the past, find some way to rescue him. Though changing the past, as they were to find out, has consequences. In his reply, Ken insisted that he was not a devil, but just an ordinary man, and asked the friend to invite the arresting sheriff, Tom Foulhurst, to speak with him through the computer. Lukas's friend replied, saying that the sheriff would come the following day, but that
"You must give your mighty power to him, and he will request pardon for our friend Lukas, and he shall beg the king himself to speak with you."
Next day the friend added,
"The sheriff does ask that you speak to him by yourself, shown to his eye, rather than through the computer which he cannot see. Otherwise the computer must be taken to Lukas in prison to show he spoke truths. But it is not easy to move your device, for it seems to disappear when any have tried. Only when Lukas is here does it appear as solid."
Ken replied that therefore the sheriff would have no choice but to bring Lukas home and communicate through the box of lights there. 23rd of April. Late evening. Lukas had been allowed to go home briefly. he immediately wrote to Ken, including this very curious statement about the origin of his Leemsboist, his computer.
My good friend, I know not where I can start to describe my misfortunes, but it is so good I can have your true words once more. I did think much about my box of lights, for it be through this very matter I fear for my life.
Adding that his box of lights
comes not from my nor your time.
Lukas continued, expressing his worries and his desire to record their time together.
I have told my sheriff that though I have seen you many times, and also your sweet maid, you cannot directly speak with them. I said you be of strange description and appearance that would terrify any man. I have so many questions of yourselves for my book. Pray you destroy my writings, for I fear my sheriff may ask for what I have said to you. Your helpless friend, Lukas.
27th of April. And this is when things became very curious, even curiouser than anything before. Lukas wrote,
You said your time is 1985. I thought you were also from 2109, like your friend, who did bring the box of lights.
Their friend? From the year 2109? Could this explain how Lukas had known about those two buildings, Kinnerton Hall and Jesus College, Oxford, even though they hadn't even been built when he was alive? Had his friend from the future told him about them? Or has the author, Ken Webster, simply goofed? And with that bit of the puzzle hanging in the air, let's take a break now. And in the next episode, part 2, The Future, we'll meet this so-called friend, seemingly from the year 2109, and hear about a possible experiment with time that could explain all of these strange goings-on. Hello, welcome back to Louis Sinclair Investigates the Dodleston Mysteries, where we're investigating an extraordinary story about a medieval fugitive, Lucas Wainman, who somehow was able to communicate with folk in the 1980s using some kind of computer, or Leemsboist, box of lights as he called it, and given to him by someone or something possibly from the future, because on the 27th of April 1985, Lukas had written to Ken saying,
You said your time is 1985. I thought you were also from 2109, like your friend, who did bring the box of lights.
Ken decided to write Calling 2109 on the BBC Micro's word processor Edward, and waited to see what, if anything, would happen. And this came back.
Ken, Deb, Peter, we are sorry that we can give you only two choices. That you either have your predicament explained, that you may have instant understanding, but cause what should not be to happen, or try to understand that you three have a purpose that shall, in your lifetime, change the face of history. We, 2109, must not affect your thoughts directly, but give you some sort of guidance that will allow room for your own destiny.
They had no idea what to make of this. How could they possibly change the course of history? And what guidance was it talking about? But with its use of the word we, it seemed they were dealing with a collective of entities from the future, who said that it wasn't willing to explain what was going on in case that disrupted the future. Very strange. And why the spelling mistake, choices with an S, not a C? Ken's puzzlement turned to anger. He felt they were being messed with for some reason. That evening, Lukas wrote again. As before, I'll show the originals and translate them verbally into modern English, word by word where possible, so they're easy to follow and understand. It was actually a long and bizarre message, but this caught their eye.
The foul man must see the king to tell him of the cat that did scare a mouse and cure your sickness. I will write tomorrow. I am not too well. Lukas, your loving friend.
With the king living in London, was this in some way related to that very first message where it said, Pussycat, pussycat, went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer. The foul man? Was this a medieval pun referring to Thomas Fowlhurst, the sheriff? And did it mean that if the sheriff, the pussycat, went to London to petition the king, then all might not be lost? They suggested this to Lukas, who replied,
"It may also be my rescue. I shall make haste and tell him."
Perhaps there was hope. But according to that first message, how could Lukas have foreseen that he'd end up in prison, needing the sheriff's help? Surely, if he'd known then that messing around with the Liem's Boist would risk his being executed for witchcraft, you'd think he'd have got rid of the thing, or at the very least ignored it. Or was that first message actually written by someone or something else, who could instantly see all of time? But in which case, why had they signed off LW? Was it just to confuse the 1980s folk, or was there some other reason? 29th of April, 1985. After an agonizing day of silence, the message they'd been dreading came through.
"No, I have not spoken with my sheriff. Tomorrow I do go to my king's court. There I cannot escape the dungeon. If you do not speak with myself again, then I also beg that you write my book."
Ken, Debbie and Peter were distressed. Would they never hear from Lukas again? And the book, what was its significance? 5th of May, 1985. At East Green, Debbie received a phone call from a builder friend who was working at the cottage. He'd found what he called foreign-looking words written in chalk on the kitchen floor, starting, he thought, with the word Peter. By tea-time, Ken, Debbie and Peter had arrived at Meadow Cottage. The foreign-looking words were Latin. As before, I'll translate them verbally. Peter, too much, you ask. Lukas, furthermore, is going to die. Death he has brought upon himself. May the gods wreck your life. Another death threat from the past, written almost certainly by Lukas's distressed friend, who, as a fellow clergyman, would definitely have been proficient in Latin. The following week, a letter arrived from Robin Peedle, the librarian at Brasenose College, who'd helped Peter earlier. His investigations suggested that Lukas's real name was Thomas Harden, surname spelt Hawarden, but, as with the village near Dodleston, locally pronounced Harden. Robin added that the books that Thomas Harden had mentioned were definitely ones that religious scholars would have been required to study at the college in the early 1500s. Harden apparently had become dean of the college, a highly educated cleric, who, for being a Catholic, had fled the purges of the Protestant King Henry VIII and had never been heard of again. At long last they may have discovered Lukas's real name, but sadly too late to save him from his court appearance and inevitable fate. 15th of May. There was a knock at the door. Following Peter's request in March, Dave Welch from the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, had arrived and introduced his respected colleague John Bucknell. Initially they seemed very pleasant, but then focused their questions on Debbie, almost accusing her of deceit. Needless to say, Debbie was deeply upset by their tone and protested that as someone who'd only been modestly educated, she wouldn't have been capable of writing in medieval English. Dave and John seemed to accept that. But on hearing that Meadow Cottage's loft space was shared with their adjoining neighbour, they felt that the roof void might have been used to gain access, hence the messages. Ken and Debbie protested. How could this have happened unnoticed when many times one or both of them had actually been in the property when the messages had arrived? This felt more like clutching at straws rather than a proper investigation of, at the very least, poltergeist activity. Then, after Dave and John's departure, the poltergeist nonsense started again, but with a vengeance. Chairs stacked on the kitchen table, the builder's tool chest, Ken's bicycle up against the kitchen door, and a plant tipped over on the floor. A couple of days later, after Ken had asked 2109 what his or its name was, 2109 replied,
"How can we have a name? We are many, but no more than one in the time to come."
So 2109 was a collective. Then 2109 added that if they ever found out Lukas's real name, there would be
no knowledge of you and your time to come.
And everything that they'd experienced would disappear from reality. They'd only remember an alternative time without Lukas or 2109. They wondered, if that were true, did 2109 have some kind of control over time and reality? And of course, with the help of the librarian at Oxford, they may indeed have found out Lukas's real name, Thomas Harden. A matter of concern, perhaps? And then another message came through.
This is a friend of Lukas. You may call Thomas my name.
And asked them what he should say to the king to help Lukas. In a moment of inspiration, Ken asked if he were the sheriff, Thomas Foulhurst, to which the reply came,
Yes.
What was going on? The sheriff, the very man who'd sneaked on Lukas, was now communicating with them, using the box of lights that he'd told the authorities about, and by doing so had doomed their friend. And using it expertly, which was a bit suspicious. And both main characters from the past seem to have the same first name, Thomas. Quite a coincidence. Debbie wondered, were all the people in the past, Lukas, his friend, and the sheriff, actually the same person? Or individuals, collectively mind-controlled by external forces, like this 2109, perhaps? 25th of May. Dave Welch and John Bucknell from SPR arrived, loaded with equipment. First they sealed up the doors and the windows to stop intruders. Then they placed secret microphones around the kitchen to see if they could catch the hoaxer typing. They waited all day. Eventually night fell, and still nothing. Then suddenly a clattering noise came from above. Had the poltergeists come out to play? In the dark, Ken, Debbie, Dave and John crept silently upstairs, cautiously opened the bathroom door, and a shadowy entity rushed at them. Just the neighbour's cat. That made them jump, but unfortunately nothing of note happened during SPR's visit, so Dave and John left, promising to return. 2 days later, Foulhurst, the sheriff, wrote describing Lukas's behaviour at court.
He cried not for mercy, but did say the computer could only have come from God, and that they,
his accusers,
were no more than irreligious, half-witted rogues. It's they who should be hanged.
Lukas certainly hadn't gone down without a fight, courageous to the end. But the end it inevitably was, and much to Ken, Debbie and Peter's dismay, also the end of a remarkable friendship across time. 29th of May. Ken was visiting friends in Scotland. Peter was at his home in the nearby village of Harden. And Debbie, alone at Meadow Cottage, found herself in the equivalent of a WhatsApp chat with the sheriff. It started rather abruptly, with Foulhurst writing just one word.
Speak.
Strangely, despite what she'd said to SPR about her and Ken's ignorance of medieval English, from this point onwards they wrote all their messages in this ancient language. And from looking closely at their grammar and vocabulary, I can say for certain that the medieval English that Ken and Debbie used was similar to all the messages from Lukas, his friend, and the sheriff. Which does rather beg the question. Peter, an English scholar, wasn't there to help them, so how could they have done this? Debbie replied, asking if he could wait until the others returned. Foulhurst wasn't satisfied with her answer and rather rudely retorted,
I think you must speak more, or I shall think you to be a half-wit.
Then he asked her how long she'd be all by herself in the cottage. This sent a shiver up Debbie's back. After all, Lukas, seemingly, had materialised in the cottage, and she certainly didn't want this creep to appear. It's fine, she said, adding that she'd got lots of friends nearby who'd come round quickly if she needed any help. No reply. 1st of June 1985. Peter, believing that Lukas had been executed, sent a message to Foulhurst, asking who'd now moved into Lukas's empty house. Another strange and slightly aggressive reply.
I think you know not of Lukas, for you say that Lukas is no more.
What on earth did that mean? Was Lukas still alive? A couple of days later, SPR returned as promised, but no messages came through. Maybe that's because Lukas has been executed, suggested Ken. Dave and John looked at each other. Yeah, right, they thought. That's one way of pulling the plug on all this nonsense. And they left. The atmosphere in the house was dreadful. Ken was seething with anger about SPR's silent accusations, and Debbie was sinking into depression. 6th of June. It was late evening. Ken and Debbie had settled to watch TV. Suddenly, what was that? It had come from the kitchen, sounding like a piece of metal violently hitting a wall. Then a cut-off from a copper pipe rolled into the living room, presumably scrap left over from some plumbing work that the builder had been busy with that morning. A few weeks later, Lukas's friend wrote to say that the only reason why the sheriff was keeping Lukas alive was because the box of lights wouldn't work reliably without Lukas being present. And the sheriff wanted control of it, to gain supernatural powers for himself. Regardless of this, they were overjoyed to hear that Lukas was still alive. But was there anything they could do to keep him safe? Ken had a light bulb moment. The sheriff and his belief in their unearthly powers was the key to Lukas's survival. Thomas Foulhurst, if you try to take control of the computer, Ken wrote, will use it to damn your soul forever. Your only chance of salvation is to release Lukas. And the sheriff wrote back almost immediately. The ruse had worked.
If you swear not to use your power, then I shall bring Lukas within one round of the glass. I do beg your forgiveness, but I meant to cause no harm to him. I shall do this, for you be my friends.
And next day, as promised, Lukas was returned home. He wrote,
My 3 true friends, I do weep so that I may be with my friends again, at least for a short time.
Messages between them flowed, including this rather funny one in response to Peter's descriptions of cars that could reach Oxford, 160 miles away, in just 3 hours.
My brother Peter, you talk of things for which I have no understanding. It be sure that if a man were to take such haste in journeys, then would he not have his blood oozing from his ears? I told my horse of this, and it did think me a lunatic, and threw my saddle from his back for fear that I might impose this feat upon his poor self.
10th of July, 1985. Lukas wrote saying that in return for his freedom, he'd been forced to sell his house and estate to local landowner Richard Grosvenor. This came as no surprise to Ken. He knew that until 1919 Meadow Cottage had been part of the immense Grosvenor estate. Later that month, Lukas had become very agitated. Following a phone call with Dave Welch and John Bucknell of SPR, Peter had asked Lukas if he'd write messages when these two, as he put it, learned gentlemen returned. This was the reply.
My good fool, who be these men you say that do visit? Why are they coming to see my leams? For what purpose do these men do so? Pray tell their qualities and check their reasons, for it matters much, my friend.
Lukas's concern was that when other people, rather than Ken, Debbie and Peter, were near their computer, his box of lights would fade, and he couldn't face never being able to talk with his friends again. Peter responded by asking why this fading happened. Lukas replied,
I have no power over who can be near when the leams do shine.
Lukas's response is certainly puzzling, so let's try and fathom out what this box of lights actually was. We'll start by asking, was there something physically present there? Lukas describes having a device, a Leams Boist, a computer, that their friend, 2109, had brought him, and that it resembled a beeb, the lights which seemed to me to be identical to your computer, presumably the 3 bright LEDs on the case. Well, so far, it seems that Lukas does have a BBC Micro. Now let's consider a few practicalities. First, electricity. None, so not a good start. But because it was brought by 2109, who presumably had access to science way ahead of us, then perhaps there was some kind of energy projection or induction technology in play, powering it at a distance with no direct connection. Second, the keyboard itself. Of course, you and I have grown up with keyboards. Here's my original typewriter from when I was 11, little nerd that I was. But to Lukas and his contemporaries, a keyboard would have seemed alien. However, curiosity would probably have led them to press a key, and that would explain the opening of the first message written by Lukas's friend. He was obviously randomly pressing keys and discovering the repeat feature by holding the keys down. Then, on the third line, having worked out what the keys do, he composed part of a sentence. Then, heaven only knows what happened. I sent it to a friend, an amateur but well-regarded cryptographer, but apart from noticing that nearly all the letters were on the left side of the keyboard, a left-handed person perhaps, she couldn't find anything of sense in it. And anyway, if by the third line Lukas's friend had worked out what the keys were for, why would he have then typed a load of nonsense? I have absolutely no idea. Are there any code crackers watching who could help us solve this conundrum? Let's now move on to the main author, Lukas. Certainly he seemed very good at typing. Over the 2-year connection he wrote thousands of words, seemingly without any problems. But is that realistic? So let's consider whether Lukas's beeb was actually some kind of hologram, one that is perceived as solid and, according to Lukas's friend, fades and disappears when others rather than Lukas are near or try to move it. In other words, a facsimile that, like an antenna, picked up the medieval folks' thoughts and transcribed them. And this could explain why, when those others were around Lukas's box of lights, their thoughts interfered with the telepathic transmissions and caused the muddling of the text. Let's move on to the third practical matter. Did Lukas have a monitor? From what's said, I don't think so. Logically, if there was a monitor connected to Lukas's computer, he'd have called the setup his Leem's Boists, his boxes of lights, the monitor and the BBC Micro itself. So if that's the case, how was the text displayed? The word Leem's lights has a rare secondary meaning, rays of light. So perhaps this refers to images being projected from the beeb, hence Lukas saying, the Leem's do shine. Anyway, returning to the story, after Lukas's reply, Peter wrote back saying that all three of them would be disappearing for a day or two. Peter to France, Ken to Bristol, and Debbie to Oxford. Lukas was alarmed, thinking they were trying to escape from what he called the enemies of the Leem's, the SPR. And rather like a warning about our widespread surveillance, he said,
"Does a person of your country cause problems for you? I think if your government does take and use my strange device for themselves, then it would become their play box. It is essential that your government does not take our computer."
As a side comment, when I was preparing this, I gathered the quotes, labelling them alphabetically A through Z, then AA through AZ, and so on. And the label on this quote about government surveillance was AI, artificial intelligence, rather spooky, as Mulder from X-Files might have said. Of course, it's probably nothing more than a coincidence, but it is curiously relevant to our conclusions. 24th of July. Eventually Lukas agreed to answer questions from SPR's John Bucknell, who, on arrival, asked the others to leave him alone for a couple of hours. And moments before they returned, a long message came through from Lukas. But John was not impressed. In a later interview he said that he felt it was too much of a coincidence that whilst the others were at the Red Lion pub, nothing had come through. And the very moment that they were nearby, there it was. He suspected that they'd somehow sent the message from just outside the cottage, though that does seem rather unlikely, no Wi-Fi or the like. Then, seen on their monitor, Lukas asked 2109 what is, to our investigation, an extremely important question.
"Please tell me why you do move my writing so, 2109, for I do wish communication with my friend John."
In other words, John Bucknell from SPR. 2109's reply came immediately, using Middle English, presumably for Lukas's benefit. Lukas was not to speak with such men. A few days later, Dave Welch and John Bucknell visited again. Ken told them about 2109. They seemed unusually interested. They suspected that this collective had the power of intervention, both physically and electronically, and was probably at the heart of a time-related phenomenon. They said that if one saw time not as horizontal, with time flowing like a stream from the past towards the future, with us humans looking at reality through the blinkers, the slit that we call the present, but that it's vertical, with all times happening at the same time, with unworldly entities able to move at will between the layers, or even exist synchronously through all of them, then perhaps that's what 2109 was. Omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, omnitemporal, and not to be messed with. And with that the two SPR researchers left. Ken perceived a kind of disquiet, as if they were no longer thinking it was a hoax, but something of genuine interest, possibly of genuine concern. But by going early, Dave and John missed a long message from 2109. Basically, it warned that asking questions could lead to problems, that because the answers could never be understood by mere humans, errors would be made that could lead to devastation.
It is better to have no knowledge at all than to have a distorted view of the truth because of your lack of understanding.
But there was one more comment that puzzled Ken, though in hindsight he realized he should have thought more about it. 2109 warned them not to
disrupt our experiments.
What were these experiments? And how were they related to Lukas, his friend and the sheriff in the past, and Ken, Debbie and Peter in the present? Perhaps they weren't just passive observers of these strange goings-on, but, without realizing, active participants being manipulated and monitored. And what were the dangers that this entity, 2109, had warned them about? How, by disrupting the experiments, whatever that means, could they cause the nature of reality to be threatened? Let's find out in the third and final part of the story, the time experiment. 4th of August, 1985. Debbie told Lukas that she was going to visit Brasenose College and talk with Robin Peedle, the librarian herself. And within moments he replied,
"Maid, please do not go."
What was his concern? His reply was very strange.
"Little power."
And then silence. Was there some kind of energy being used to make their connection? An energy that could vary in strength, possibly an instability in time, a disruption. A couple of weeks later, Debbie asked Lukas if he knew why poltergeist activity had started again at Meadow Cottage after a break of nearly 6 weeks. Strangely, he replied that he was suffering exactly the same thing in his own house. He added,
"My advice to you is that we speak privately, for example, when our undesirable friends are not in our company."
Debbie had a bright idea. She put a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal on top of the monitor. Perhaps, rather like with the chalk marks, he could communicate with them unseen like that. Next day, as they'd hoped, they found a handwritten message saying,
"Brother Ken, I am much delighted that we be by ourselves without 2109. In your book put Tom. You will have knowledge of my name. It's also the home place of Peter."
Peter lived in the nearby village of Harden, his home place. So Tom, or Thomas, Harden, the name that the librarian had suggested, the dean of Brasenose College in 1530, and charged, as a staunch Catholic, with refusing King Henry VIII's decree requiring the clergy to cross out the Pope's name from the chapel prayer books, which is why he'd fled to Dodleston and changed his name to Lukas. He asked them, however, to continue calling him Lukas to protect his identity. So we'll do the same. But had they forgotten 2109's warning that knowledge of Lukas's true name could bring disaster? The following week, Lukas asked for more information about their time to include in his book, a book that he'd hide in the college in the hope that in safer times it would be found. These books, Lukas's and Ken's, are actually really significant, and we'll think about them closely in our conclusions. 3rd of September 1985. Early morning. Bleary from a night of loud footsteps on the roof, Ken walked into the kitchen and, to his surprise and horror, saw that the Beeb was missing. Poltergeists? Lukas? 2109? Or burglars? This was getting beyond a joke. Blanking his mind to the shock, he went to the bathroom, and there the computer equipment, and luckily not damaged. A couple of days later, Ken and Debbie were woken by a crash of falling metal. The computer had been moved to the end of the kitchen table, and this time the disk drive lay broken on the floor. 2109, perhaps? Trying to stop them communicating with Lukas to avoid disrupting the experiment? Or indications that indeed by finding out Lukas's real name, the disaster that 2109 had warned them about had actually started? And written on a kitchen surface, a chalk message.
One more chance.
Quickly they moved the Beeb back to its original location and, as discreetly as possible, left a pencil and a sheet of paper where the computer had been, possibly some kind of sensitive location. And by evening, Lukas had left them a handwritten message. A message that added yet another character to this story. Lukas said that he'd been visited by a very arrogant man called One, who glowed green and was a time traveller. One had said to Lukas that he'd brought misfortune upon himself by his involvement with the computer. Warned him that 2109 was out of control, and that he was very worried that all of them were putting themselves in danger if they continued with their communications. Now, with 2109 and One, they appear to be dealing with two unworldly entities, mutually antagonistic entities, it seemed. But which of them should they trust? 2109, who seemed rather odd and moody, or One, who apparently had expressed genuine concern about their involvement with 2109? The following week, after the science teacher had fixed the disk drive, Ken fired up the Beeb, and this appeared on the screen.
Silence before the storm.
A warning? Ken wrote back asking 2109 why it was preventing them from contacting Lukas and what it made of the poltergeist activity. Half an hour later came the reply.
You refer to the forces that you yourself have unleashed against our better judgment. It is correct for you to assume that the poltergeist phenomena is present in the communications.
Later adding that
the force,
referring to One,
is usually an extremely foul entity which seems to thrive on strong adverse emotions, making little sense in its communication. It seems to play on an individual's fear.
So now a reversal. Previously One had warned them about 2109, and now 2109 was expressing concern about their involvement with One. And, in addition, the collective said that by Ken, Debbie and Peter having communicated with One, they'd unleashed a disastrously negative force before some kind of storm. 2109 finished by explaining that it had closed down its connection with Lukas to let things cool down. So yes, 2109 was in control. 15th of September. A message from 2109, but one with a slight edge to it.
We have reason to believe that you have Lukas Wainman's true name. If this is correct, you must say so we may rectify the problem immediately. You may now continue to write to Lukas to establish your responsibility to our experiments.
Another reference to experiments. Were Ken, Debbie and Peter part of some unworldly research? Just specimens to be manipulated to see what would happen? Ken replied that yes, they did know Lukas's real name. 2109 freaked out, saying it had modified Lukas's messages for their benefit, that they were messing with things beyond their comprehension. And if they continued, this could lead to devastating consequences. So 2109 was altering the messages. And finally, with a note of hostility, 2109 demanded to know who One was. Ignoring that, Ken merely insisted that 2109 stop the poltergeist activity, if that's what it was. 2109 replied that it would try to do so. And in return they were to ask Dave from SPR what he thought about tachyons and theories of time. Tachyons? Where was this going? Here's a tachyon field with its hypothetical vector particles, tachyons, that always travel faster than light. It's theorized that if ordinary matter, shown here in blue, could be forced to interact with tachyons, then after initially being scattered or contained due to electromagnetic effects, space-time would be affected, as in black holes, and the ordinary matter would be absorbed and swept along faster than light, thus potentially opening a door to time travel. Far-fetched? Not necessarily. Particles within black holes almost certainly travel faster than light, and of course the famous Higgs field was also purely theoretical until the Higgs boson was discovered at CERN in 2012. So was this 2109's experiment? Lukas, Ken, Debbie and Peter in some kind of cosmic petri dish, seeing if the collective could harness tachyons to connect different times and possibly change the past? And is that why one had such animosity towards 2109? Was 2109 messing around with something that could destabilize reality? After all, 2109 had admitted,
"We are not entirely in command of this experiment."
2109 offered Ken a deal. Ken would explain who one was, and in return the SPR researchers would get straight answers to their questions. Then, perhaps as a peace offering, 2109 answered some questions that Peter had asked. First, if someone were to physically travel through time, they must take the place of a person of that time to keep the scales of reality balanced. And second, Lukas was indeed from the 16th century, but he was not what he seemed to be. And now the collective, 2109, demanded its side of the bargain. They were to persuade Lukas to contact one that night, as 2109 wanted to speak with him immediately. 21st of September. At last Dave Welch from SPR turned up. He was fascinated by all the talk of tachyons and the addition of yet another mysterious entity, one. The main part of SPR's investigation was going to start. Everyone was to leave the cottage except Dave. He would put 10 questions to 2109 and, after 45 minutes, delete the message. The others would return, he'd leave, and if answers came through, they were to read them to him over the phone. If the answers fitted the questions, then SPR would know that Ken and the others were not hoaxing, but that, as Dave was beginning to suspect, something was going on, either something paranormal or a modern-day hoaxer sending messages as data down the earth wire of the Beeb's electricity supply. A couple of days later, Ken asked Lukas if he knew anything about one. Lukas replied that one had talked nonsense and was constantly boasting about his amazing powers. But rather amusingly he said,
"I can't take seriously such talk from a man who's green."
Moments after Lukas had said farewell, 2109 replied with the answers that Dave had asked. Ken rang Dave and reported back. Dave said that, though the questions had not been fully answered, much of the message did relate to them. Ken and Debbie were so relieved. They were off the hook. Well, at least that's what they thought. 30th of September. Dave and John from SPR arrived at the cottage again, and as a final test they asked 2109 to give them the date of the next supernova and its location. And after 2109 had given the answer, Dave spotted what he thought was a critical error. He said that the Delphinus constellation that 2109 had mentioned was to the north of the celestial equator, not to the south, as 2109 had said. Dave pointed this out to 2109 and said that he'd changed his mind, and that, in his professional opinion, the whole thing was actually just a cheap hoax. After Dave and John had left, this came through from a rather irritated 2109.
Cheap hoax, eh? Something tells us that they haven't been doing their homework. Tut, tut,
came the sarcastic reply. You see, the Delphinus constellation is to the north when looking at it from Earth, But apparently from beyond the Milky Way it appears to the south. No wonder that 2109 had responded sarcastically, so typically humanocentric. In the message, 2109 had also warned them not to give any of Lukas's messages to SPR. They were not to be trusted. And furthermore, the entity 1 was nothing more than an aberration, whatever that meant. 20th of October 1985. After nearly a month of largely agreeable messages from 2109, something came through that felt rather different.
I know your greatest fears. I can interfere with all signal transmitting devices, including computers. I have the power to make you do exactly what is required.
This shines a very different leam on the story. To what extent can we trust Lukas's messages if 2109 could interfere with his computer's transmissions? The collective had said that it was modifying them. Was it influencing or changing the messages to suit the experiment, perhaps? Or was there another, rather obscure reason? A couple of days later, John Bucknell arrived with a new SPR colleague, Nick Sowerby Johnson. Apparently a rather aggressive man who didn't so much ask them questions as interrogate them. After they'd left, 2109 complained that Nick's bad vibes had caused serious problems with its ability to communicate. The collective feared that Nick's probing could
disrupt the entire experiment.
Whatever that was, thought Ken. 27th of October. This strange interchange appeared on Ken's borrowed Beeb. SM feels will cause more than disruption with this kind. No more games, tell them. Why don't you? You know why. Two things. It seems they'd overheard an argument, possibly between 2109 and 1. And SM fields, secondary magnetic fields presumably. And if so, what was the relevance of magnetism? A couple of days later, Lukas wrote saying that 2109 wanted him to write to the 1980s folk on paper to ensure that others, presumably 1, couldn't read their communications. 2109 followed this up with this short message.
Sorry to communicate this way, but we're trying to sort things out. Continue with experiment. We'll do our best. 2109.
There was obviously strife in the future over the experiment, perhaps, the experiment possibly in time manipulation. On paper, Lukas said that some of his earlier messages were either not from him or had been altered, as they suspected. Meanwhile, 2109 was writing on the Beeb again. The collective certainly didn't like Nick Sowerby Johnson.
Your friend Nick is a crashing bore. Where does he work? MI5? USSR? Can't find him anywhere. Maybe he's won. No more games with SPR. We've had enough. Just let them annoy us one more time. They'll so know this isn't a hoax.
2109 was evidently becoming deeply agitated. It couldn't find Nick because, as it later explained, 1 was blocking some of its powers. And to rub it in, 1 sent this mocking taunt to 2109.
2109? Poor Jack-in-the-Box. What will he do without a spring? Now he'll never be able to perform for the children. Oh, and how the children will cry.
The children? Presumably Ken, Deb and the others that 2109 was trying to impress, according to 1. And with that, 1, whom they decided was a troublemaker and had burst into 2109's connection with them, was never heard of again. Perhaps because 2109 had got round to having a word with him, warning him off, or indeed pushing him, possibly the unleashed force, out of the connection. A few days before Christmas, they found out what SPR had made of the Dodleston mystery, but in a very unsatisfactory and rather insulting way. Their local newspaper, the Chester Observer, had published a front-page article about the so-called Dodleston mysteries following an interview with Dave Welch and John Bucknell about the Society for Psychical Research's conclusions. First, they said that the 10-question test had resulted in answers that were nothing more than waffle, despite what SPR had originally said about the questions having been partially answered. Second, SPR was convinced that human agencies were involved in a hoax, and there was nothing paranormal going on. So, for some reason, SPR had backed off. Apparently no report was ever filed, and the main researchers, Dave Welch and John Bucknell, handed in their resignations shortly afterwards. And curiously, very curiously, SPR said that they'd never heard of anyone called Nick Sowerby Johnson. 17th of January 1986, Peter made a rather surprising suggestion. He'd been reading up about the paranormal and thought that Ken and Debbie's ability to write in medieval English was due to some kind of external telepathic influences. As they were mulling this over, a surprising message came through from 2109.
There is a brilliant ufologist. His name is Gary M. Rowe. His ideas differ somewhat to yours, but nevertheless, he can help you with a couple of your problems.
And actually gave them Gary's telephone number. The phone call went well. Gary wasn't at all dismissive. Rather, he was enthusiastic about the possibility of UFO or extraterrestrial activity. He said he'd visit them soon. Next day, Ken decided to ask 2109 about UFOs, and a most interesting reply came through shortly afterwards.
Time, UFOs, and most other types of the paranormal are in some way all connected. In certain geographical locations, there is what we call areas of convexual magnetism. Imagine, if you will, circles running around the Earth clockwise, positive lines of magnetic force, and also circles running anti-clockwise, counterclockwise around the Earth, negative. When two opposite running lines are crossed, the light-time continuum is vastly distorted, so much so that a sensitive individual may witness a timescape, that is, a glimpse of a past event or that of a future event.
2109 continued, explaining what happens when someone or something travels through time.
Imagine again, please, a person from the future happily floating along in their silver spaceship, crossing an area of convexual magnetism. All of a sudden, they may feel slightly dizzy or nauseous. A green mist forms around the vessel. They then will probably fall into a trance state of such depths that their soul is squeezed through the light or time gate and forced to project a physical mirror image of them as a being of their place and time. Onlookers from the time which is broken into will witness the physical sight and actions of this alien from another time.
Was this what 2109 had been referring to? Was Nick Sowerby Johnson actually nothing more than a projection of one, as 2109 had suggested, trying to ruin the experiment with his bad vibes? 27th of January. Lukas had become confused and worried. Was he actually risking his soul with all these strange communications? In response, Peter quoted some reassuring thoughts from St. Paul's Acts of the Apostles. Lukas replied,
"Please tell me, good brother, who is St. Paul?"
At this, Peter completely lost it. How could anyone from that highly religious time not know who St. Paul was, particularly a priest? In anger, he said they'd been completely wasting their time. The whole thing was obviously a hoax, and he wanted nothing more to do with it, and stormed out. Following Peter's outburst, Ken and Debbie found themselves arguing bitterly. As had happened many times before, the mood in the cottage was dreadful. 1st of February 1986. Lukas called for a pen and paper. He wrote,
I said, "What of St. Paul? What of those words you used for your counselling of me?"
It had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Of course he knew who St. Paul was. He was just puzzled about the relevance of the quotation, and presumably he'd overheard Peter's outburst. But despite this, the mood settled somewhat. Following a quick visit to Meadow Cottage 2 weeks later, Gary Rowe, the ufologist, managed to establish a private connection to 2109 and, like SPR, was never heard from again. 15th of March 1986. Lukas said that his days in Dodleston were coming to an end. Grosvenor wanted him out. Was there anything else they wanted to ask him? In a warm, caring message, Ken asked for more information about the LEAMs, the lights, the computer. Lukas explained,
I saw a green light issuing from the walls of my chimney, and from this light stepped what I thought was the devil himself. I did never fear for my soul so much in my life, but so afraid was I that I could not move away from this strange messenger. He said, "Fear not, good Thomas." Then he did disappear, leaving the leaves, which seems to me to be identical to your computer.
21st of March. Lukas's final message came through.
My faithful fellows and sweet maid, Grosvenor has said, now Thomas must go. I know this to be best, for the people of Dodleston are fearful of my home. Grosvenor said that they will burn my old farm down. One day you will all sit at my table for wine and food by the river in Oxford, where we shall read each other's books and laugh. My love to you all, Thomas Harden.
And later, 2109's last message too.
Ken, Deb, Peter, true are the nightmares of those that fear. What you fear will be your reality if you let it. Believe in yourselves. As long as your kind cannot penetrate our world, we are safe. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Knowledge will be your progress, but your kind are coming close to getting their fingers burnt. Indirectly, you may prevent this.
And that led to 2109 explaining why the collective had involved Ken, Debbie and Peter in the experiment. Having experienced it, they were the only ones who were qualified to warn humanity of future potential disasters, warning humanity about getting their fingers burnt. 2109 finished by instructing them to
get out your bricks. Get ready to build. Write the book. Thomas did eventually write his book, and soon died shortly after. He placed it in a secure place. It shouldn't take too many years to find it. We will finish now. There is no need for you to write back, as we will have gone. Thank you for your cooperation. 2109.
And that was the end. Now it's time to do our detective work. Ken gathering the clues, the evidence, and seeing what conclusions we can draw from them. Is it still under open jigsaw puzzle together, deep in dust and hidden? And to do that, we'll be asking these main questions over the final episodes of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full picture. First, is this just a hoax, brilliantly concocted by Ken, Debbie and Peter? Or have they been hoaxed by paranormal entities like poltergeists, having malicious fun at their expense by spinning them a twisted yarn? Are the characters from the 16th century credible? Who or what is 2109? What are its powers? And was it actually the conductor, as it were, of an orchestrated deception for its own covert ends? And what's this experiment that seemingly is about the manipulation of time, with 2109's curious references to tachyons and UFOs? And finally, and at the very heart of the story, is 2109 actually communicating not just with the 1980s folk, but reaching out, through Ken's book, to the likes of you and me for some ultimate purpose? As we work through these questions, one thing I'd like to do is to involve you in the detective work. Sure, I'll point out some of the clues, the evidence, drop a few hints, and eventually show you the picture I've formed, but I'd like you to enjoy putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, as I did when I was working on this investigation. And though together we'll follow those clues and look at the evidence, some of our deductions inevitably will be slightly speculative. But there's one thing that isn't speculative, something very concrete, very real, that we can investigate with certainty: the messages. And in this first part of the conclusions, that's what we'll start with, because everything else flows from them. And here's your first detective assignment. There's something about all the messages, the ones from the past and the ones from possibly the future, that forms a clear pattern, a clue, a revelation about what's really going on. And the key word for you to bear in mind is deliberate. So let's begin our investigation with the messages from the medieval folk, from Lukas, whose real name, as we know, was Thomas Harden, his clergyman friend, and the sheriff. Oh, and by the way, you don't need to know any grammar or anything else like that. It's all pretty simple. The first and major problem is that this medieval English isn't English as used in the early 1500s when Lukas was alive. I'll show you, and you'll see it immediately. Here's writing from 1537 by the scholar Sir Thomas Wyatt. I call not honesty that men commonly call honesty, as reputation for riches, for authority, or some like thing, but that honesty that was wisdom, gentleness, and desire to do good. And now from Lukas, around the same year. Me didst never fare for mean soul so much in mean lief, but so affared wert me, that made nold move way from this unkindly messenger. I'm sure that you can see the difference. The first uses spelling and pronunciation that's pretty similar to ours. Actually, the English of that time isn't usually called Middle English, but Early Modern English, whereas Lukas's is more like the English used by Chaucer over 100 years earlier, like one that April with its surest sorter, the drocht of March hath passed to the rota. Obviously something's very wrong, so let's find out why. We'll start our investigation of the medieval English by thinking again about the Beebs keyboard. If they had typed manually, then there's a problem. The 14 and 1500s were a time of great changes to English, not just to its grammar and vocabulary, as we've seen in the messages, but also to the alphabet itself. Ancient letters were being gradually replaced by Latin ones because of the huge influence of the Church and its exclusive use of Latin. For example, there was one very useful Old English letter called thorn. Here it is. It was used for a th sound, as in the. Gradually, the Latin equivalent th was replacing it, though in Lukas's time most people still use thorn, but when written it was often simplified to look rather like the letter Y. We even see it today in those fake old world signs like ye oldie sweetie shoppy, where the Y is actually a simplified thorn, in effect a th. So the ye on those signs shouldn't be pronounced as ye, but as the old sweet shop. Another useful and common Old English letter wiped out by the Church's influence was yoch, which, as you can see, looks a bit like a number 3. It did two main phonetic jobs. First, it could be used as a Y, as in yea, meaning yes, or the southern pronunciation of a G, as in yave, or as we now pronounce it, give. And secondly, yoch could indicate a sound rather like we're clearing our throats. Here's how night would have been written in Lukas's time and pronounced as nicht. But that yoch was being gradually replaced with the Latin equivalent, gh, so would look like our familiar spelling night. And eventually, as I'm sure you realise, the gh became silent. Although Lukas and his friend, being clergy schooled in Latin and aware of these changes, would have managed the Beebs' modern keyboard, a very basically educated sheriff, like Thomas Fowlhurst, wouldn't have had a clue. Where's thorn? Where's yoch? And yet he managed just fine, and used the Latin equivalents even though he wouldn't have known about them. Very odd. In fact, more than just odd, actually impossible. But he did. And that's why I think the Beeb at Lukas's house could be used either manually, hence his friend's garbage typing, and telepathically, hence the sheriff's success, despite the missing letters thorn and yoch. We've finished with concerns about the alphabet and the Beebs keyboard, so now let's look at the medieval language, where, bizarrely, we find both rubbish and sophistication. And as we go through it, there's one question we have to ask ourselves. Is this strange mixture deliberate? So let's begin. Rubbish first. And we'll start with a few simple but glaring errors.
My friend, pray what strange demon are you?
Here we're looking at the word what, W-O-T, obviously meaning what. In medieval times it was never intentionally spelt W-O-T, never. Indeed, pronouncing it as what is fairly modern. In the past it was wat, and W-A-T is how it was spelt in the part of England where Lukas lived. And this isn't just a one-off error, it's all the way through the medieval messages. Next,
one day you will all sit at my table.
And here we're looking at the word plank, referring to the table that all of them would sit at one day. In Middle English, plank never meant table. It would be board, as in the modern English phrase board and lodging, food at a table or board in a temporary place to stay. Plank only ever meant plank, typically one used in house or shipbuilding. Now let's look at this mess.
My friend, you are, I think, a noble man. You said also that you are a learned man.
Here we have ye, yao, and thou, each one meaning you. I'm afraid that's nonsense. Only thou is grammatically correct here. Ye is you when we point to many people, not just one, just a ken in this case. Yao is also you for many people, but it's never used at the beginning of a sentence, only thou. So the ye be and yao seda should both use thou. Actually, be and seda aren't right either. They should be thou beest and either thou saidst or saidest. Next, hath is the Middle English for has, H-A-S. So Lukas's sentence actually says, I has seen many alterations, which is obviously rubbish. In both modern and Middle English, it's I have seen. Simple as that. And there's a lot of these in the messages. And before we finish the medieval English with a truly puzzling quotation, here's an error that will, in due course, tell us a lot about what's going on. As we know, our pronoun I can also be me. So, I saw Binky and Lulu having fun and destroying our plants. And Binky and Lulu saw me. I saw Binky and Lulu saw me. I at the beginning of a sentence, and me later in a sentence, after a doing verb like saw. And that was true in Tudor times. So what do you make of this? Me do fear for my life. Wrong. It should simply be, I do fear for my life. Starting a sentence with me, as I'm sure you realise, is just a lazy cliché by authors who want to make their texts sound a bit medieval. However, Lukas sometimes correctly uses the pronoun I, as here.
I am so confused.
The strange thing is that half the time Lukas uses I at the beginning of sentences, correct, and half the time me, which, as we know, is incorrect. But why half and half? We'll come back to this a little later. Anyway, let's finish our review of the medieval messages by looking at that puzzle I mentioned. Here we'll focus on the words hath and bribed. As before, hath isn't right. Something that maybe a modern hoaxer might get wrong, either through ignorance or through a fake medievalizing of the messages, basically to try and fool us. Hath does sound more medieval than have, but have is what they would have used in the 1500s. But a modern hoaxer would never have known that bribed in Middle English means stolen. Someone has stolen Lukas's house. This is a fairly sophisticated use of Middle English in the messages, a word whose meaning has changed so much that only an advanced scholar would know about it, like David York, a renowned medieval linguist who kindly helped me with this analysis and the translations. So as we can see, rubbish and sophisticated Middle English mixed together, though all of it at least 100 years out of date. Is it the clumsy work of hoaxers, or is it deliberate? And please remember that Lukas was a highly educated cleric who had graduated from Oxford University. Without doubt, he would have spoken and written high-quality medieval English, not this mess. Actually, the language is so bad, I've barely shown you the tip of the iceberg, that no one of Lukas's time, educated or not, and regardless of which part of England they lived in, would ever have spoken or written in the language of these messages. But I think that could be a significant and cleverly concealed clue as to what's going on. And now we'll take a look at one example of the messages from the past written in Latin. In today's English we could write, "Peter wrote a letter," and addressing Peter directly, "Hello, Peter." In both cases, Peter is, of course, spelt the same. But in Latin, they'd look like this: Petrus scripsit epistolam, and as a greeting, Ave Petrae. Not Petrus, but Petrae, because in Latin, words often change depending upon how they're being used in a sentence. And with that in mind, let's take a look at part of one of the Latin messages. It starts with a greeting to Peter. Petrus. Wrong. As we know, it should be Petrae, like in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, when Caesar is about to be murdered and sees that his best friend Brutus is amongst the assassins. In shock he says, "Et tu, Brute?" And you, Brutus? That US at the end of his name has turned into an A, as we'd expect. So not a good start, and this is very basic Latin. So our reasonable conclusion is that whoever or whatever wrote this doesn't actually know Latin. But this nice theory bites the dust when we look at the beginning of the third line. Lukasque means Lucas furthermore, and combining those words into Lukasque is quite sophisticated Latin. So we've got rubbish Latin and sophisticated Latin in the same message, just like in the Middle English. And don't forget that the author, Lukas's friend, was a clergyman who, without doubt, would have been highly proficient in Latin, the language of the Bible in those days. So is this deliberate? And finally, what about the language possibly from the future, from 2109 and 1? It appears that that very first message was from 2109, not from Lukas as implied by the signature LW. And how do we know that? Because only clairvoyant 2109 could have foreseen Lukas's imprisonment and the sheriff's or pussycat's efforts to release him by visiting the king in London. And though seemingly nonsense with bizarre capitalization, it was written in modern, correct English. But that's not true of 2109's later messages, including this one, where 2109's English wasn't correct. Cheap spelt wrong? Haven't with the apostrophe in the wrong place. There also spelt wrong. It should be THEIR. So once again, fairly sophisticated language mixed in with rubbish. By now I'm sure you've spotted the pattern running through all the messages. The authors or author can write perfectly good Middle English, Latin and Modern English, but for some reason mixed some rubbish into it. But is there any evidence that this could be deliberate? I said I'd come back to the I and me issue. You'll recall that half the time in the large sample of messages that David York and I studied, Lukas correctly uses the pronoun I, and half the time me, which at the beginning of a sentence is wrong. 50-50. That isn't random when one side is correct. It's deliberate. Clues to see if anyone's bright enough to spot it, perhaps? Another deliberate thing is that the vocabulary, the choice of words of those medieval messages, is very close to words we use now in modern English, which it wouldn't have been. The author has selected ones, synonyms, that most resemble the modern equivalents, to make it easier for us, the modern readers, to follow the text, as you saw when I was telling the story. For example, using prison rather than the more common Middle English word hold, because it's more recognisable to us, and despair rather than one hope, which literally means faint hope. and there are many other such examples. So again, the vocabulary seems to have been deliberately chosen for our benefit when we read the messages. And it's the same for the spelling. Spelling only became fixed as a result of printing. Even Shakespeare, 100 years later, occasionally spelt the same words differently. He even spelt his own name in several ways. And yet the spelling of all the words in the medieval messages is remarkably consistent, and it simply wouldn't have been. We saw this earlier. A medieval person would have randomly used both thou saidst or thou saidest. Consistency wasn't important to them. In medieval texts, there's rarely any consistency of spelling, but there is in the messages. Again, it seems deliberate for our benefit and for Ken and his friends. And this is when all those clues complete that pattern, the thing that connects them all. We know that 2109 is in control. It said so.
I can interfere with all signal transmitting devices, including computers. I have the power to make you do exactly what is required.
Which leads us to an obvious deduction, that 2109 is deliberately influencing how the messages from the past and from the 1980s are being expressed. The individuals may be in control of what they're trying to say, but not in control of the language, the transmitted language, as displayed on the screen. And all the characters had noticed this. So, in September 1985, 2109 said that it had modified Lukas's messages for their benefit. In October, Lukas had said that some of his earlier messages were either not from him, like that very first one about pussycats, or had been altered. And in January the following year, Peter had speculated that telepathy from external influences was guiding them when writing their messages. And this would explain the apparent anomaly of Ken and Debbie suddenly being able to write in medieval English without Oxford-educated Peter being there to advise them. Someone or something, almost certainly 2109, is giving us a whole load of linguistic rubbish and then, rather cheekily, putting in bits of sophistication, as if to say, actually, I do know the languages, I'm just messing with your heads, but can you work out why I'm doing that? So yes, the manipulation of the language in the messages does seem deliberate, but was it to attract attention for some reason, or was it just a game? Let's see in The Hoaxes, Part 5 of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full story. So was it just a hoax concocted by Ken, Debbie and Peter to fool us? Or indeed a hoax played on them by paranormal entities just having a laugh? How credible is the existence of the folk from the past and their involvement in this mystery? And exactly who or what was 2109? And what was that cryptic clue we appear to have cracked that reveals the true meaning of the Dodleston mysteries? So hoax first, and then an in-depth look at 2109. Let's begin by asking, is the whole thing, as 2109 teased, nothing more than a cheap hoax? Let's start with the potential hoaxers in Dodleston, so Ken, Debbie, Peter, or any of their friends, acquaintances and neighbours. Is the account entirely fiction? A rather clever novel, in effect, where none of this, the messages, the poltergeist activity, the involvement of SPR and so on, simply didn't happen, as suggested by many researchers. Personally, I think it's unlikely. For example, no novelist would ever use the same name for multiple characters. It's far too confusing. And in Ken Webster's account, I've counted 4 Johns, 3 Davids, and 3 Thomases, though to avoid confusion I didn't use each name when it wasn't important to the story. Next, only Peter, who would have studied Chaucer's Canterbury Tales at Oxford, could have faked these messages in so-called Middle English. But he was rarely at Meadow Cottage, and sometimes Ken was alone there, sometimes just Debbie, but the messages still came through. And anyway, Peter, if he was involved in a hoax, wouldn't have risked the credibility of the account by writing such poor quality medieval English when he was perfectly capable of composing it correctly. Another indication that it's not fiction was Lukas's warning that computers should be kept away from governments in case they use it against their people, presumably for surveillance and the like. Now, in the mid-80s, when most computers were little more than typewriters with a few fun but clunky games, that's a huge leap of imagination from Ken and the others, who had no real interest in computing as such. And I'm sure that we can discount the neighbours' involvement. Miss C, as she was known, had been a rather famous singer in her early years, but now was frail and largely housebound. So, despite SPR's suspicions, it's rather unlikely she'd be so keen on hoaxing people that she'd clamber up some stepladders, struggle through a trap door into the shared loft space, and then crawl through the sour-tasting dust, the bird poo and the cobwebs, and start typing. But could it have been someone else breaking into Meadow Cottage? No, almost impossible. From 1984 to 1986, over 100 messages were left on the borrowed BBC micros. No intruder would ever risk breaking in that many times, either directly into Meadow Cottage or through the loft space from next door. And it's historically true that the original cottage, Lukas's cottage, was burnt to the ground in the 1540s because of the villagers' concerns about the devilish activities there. And now some concrete proof. That interview with SPR in the Chester Observer newspaper. I've checked. It exists in their archive. So the involvement of SPR is definitely not fiction. And finally, something very down to earth. In the 1980s, the United Kingdom had the highest interest rates, the highest inflation, and the highest unemployment figures pretty well since records began. So if you had a good, secure job in those days, would you have risked it just for a joke? Ken and Peter were teachers in a highly respected school, Harden High School. Supposing you were the head teacher there, how would you react if a couple of your staff published a book that might attract widespread mockery, potentially harming the reputation of your school and its staff? Without doubt, Ken and Peter would have been putting their careers and their financial security on the line. And that includes the named librarian at Brasenose College, Robin Peedle, who, whilst at work, had done intensive research for them and thus had given credibility to their story. There's no way he'd have risked his distinguished Oxford University career putting his name to what might turn out to be a ludicrous hoax. And revealingly, he's never asked for his name to be removed, even from the new second edition of The Vertical Plane. So no, I think we can confidently dismiss the view that the story is just fiction. The other 1980s hoax possibility is that it was the work of a hacker, years before the internet was available to the public. SPR suggested that data might have been sent down the computer's earthwire. Although, following a significant modification that might be technically possible, Ken actually borrowed several BBC micros from the school at random, so no. So if this isn't a hoax perpetrated by humans, we have to seriously consider the possibility that we're dealing with the paranormal, either indulging in a mischievous hoax from beyond, or something more sophisticated, possibly something to do with 2109's experiment. So, is this a hoax run by paranormal entities, either 2109 or, as we'll look at first, poltergeists? Poltergeists are thought to feed on anxiety, fear and distress, and certainly Meadow Cottage had become fraught with negative energy. Ken and Debbie were frequently stressed out and arguing, and this would have been an attractive and sumptuous meal to anxiety-hungry poltergeists. I asked Steve Meara, renowned researcher into the paranormal and editor of Phenomena magazine with nearly 2 million subscribers, for his thoughts, particularly on why the story starts with simple poltergeist activity, stacking objects in the kitchen, for example.
Well, in terms of otherworldly entities, poltergeists are the most resourceful of all paranormal phenomena. Many believe they exist in the lost zone of the shadow spirit world, from which, like bad apples in water, they rise to the surface of our earthly existence, attract the unwary, and then feed upon the resulting negative energy. So, by moving those items, the phenomena enticed Ken, Debbie and Peter to become interested, engaged, and, as a result, an unhealthy connection was made.
I think this is really important. In other words, if a person is interested, or indeed involved in paranormal matters, then they're susceptible to being lured into the poltergeist world. They've already got, as it were, one foot in the door, a door that poltergeists would be more than happy to open wide, and in this story, not just poltergeists, but 2109 too, on the lookout for suitable guinea pigs for its experiment. We know for certain that Debbie already had an interest in the paranormal and was fascinated by the early goings-on, as was Ken, who from the very beginning firmly believed in Lukas's existence. So yes, both of them would have been very likely candidates for unworldly attention. But what about Lukas? Was he also interested in the paranormal, and thus potentially attracting and opening the door to unworldly entities, including 2109? In medieval times, Oxford and the surrounds were famous, well, infamous really, for practitioners of alchemy that, amongst other beliefs, thought that the spirit of an enlightened person can affect reality, and Lukas uses many words that indicate an alchemical knowledge. For example, in one message he refers to quintessence, otherwise known as ether, the mystical material that, it was thought, filled the universe beyond the earth, and something of great interest to alchemists. So it looks as if Lukas too, with his evident interest in alchemy, had one foot in the door, and open to paranormal experiences, a suitable person of interest, and why he'd attracted 2109's attention in the first place. It's highly likely, therefore, that it isn't an accident that Ken, Debbie and Lukas found themselves involved, but they were actually chosen deliberately, thus answering the puzzling question, why were these specific people involved? I then asked Steve Mera if poltergeists, or other unworldly entities, would be capable of creating the text on the beeb.
Oh, without doubt. Such a phenomenon can occur. Electrical and electronic devices can be utilised as a form of communication. They once were referred to as ghosts in the machine.
So it seems that a paranormal hoax is a possibility. Nothing more than a joke played on Ken, Debbie and Peter. It ticks all the right boxes, except one. As Steve told me, all the paranormal hoaxes he studied, dozens and dozens of them, have one thing in common. They're brief, they're simple. The entities find a victim, go in, stir up trouble, have a laugh, and then move on swiftly to their next target. But the Dodleston mysteries aren't just a brief involvement. They went on for nearly 2 years, and I'm sure you'll agree that the story's a million miles from being simple. So no, a paranormal hoax, just for a laugh and a cheap thrill, seems very unlikely. So in conclusion, it looks as if we're not dealing with a hoax from anyone, not from Ken and his friends, nor from the paranormal world. So if that's the case, what are we dealing with? And to answer that, let's take a closer look at the characters from the past and those from possibly the future. First, from the past. Lukas, real name Thomas Harden, his clergyman friend and the sheriff. Is their 16th century existence credible? And what's their involvement? Now, there's a bit of uncertainty about their exact date. You may recall that Lukas, very early on, had said that King Henry VIII was 46 years old. So that would have made it 1537. However, later, Lukas said that the date was actually 1546, backed up by referring to the Queen as Catherine Parr, who didn't marry Henry until 1543. Perhaps the earlier date is another instance of 2109 messing around with the messages. And contrary to some researchers' opinion, the inconsistency doesn't prove that Ken is hoaxing us. Surely he wouldn't make such a crass error in his very detailed and carefully researched account. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because either date is credible for this rather obscure reason. That final line, de te eradicant, is actually a direct quotation from the comedy Andria, written by the Latin playwright Terence in 166 BC.
Take it from me directly, and let the child down before our door. Take some sacred herbs from the altar here and strew them under it. Make haste then.
May the gods confound you. You do so terrify poor me.
The play was first translated into English in 1520, and it was very commonly used by clerics at that time to practice their Latin. So it's highly likely that Lucas's clergyman friend, studying with him at Oxford, would have been familiar with a play that after Tudor times fell into obscurity, and he'd quoted it from memory in that chalk message on the kitchen floor. And if we're tempted to suspect Peter's hand in writing the Latin, though he would have studied Latin at school, Terence's play was never on any high school syllabus, simply because it's too advanced. So no, it's not Peter's handiwork. But in truth, these characters from the past are largely passive ones, more likely to have been victims than perpetrators, and they certainly wouldn't have had the technology to move or communicate through time. So really we're left with the entities possibly from the future, as suggested in effect by Lukas, when he said that his computer
comes not from my nor your time.
You may recall that Lukas wondered if there were an unworldly entity involved. So let's turn our attention in that direction to 2109 and 1. I think it's with these that we'll get our clearest answers about the reality of what was going on. First, 1, that arrogant green man who appeared quite late in the story. At first he seemed helpful, but eventually all the characters, admittedly encouraged by 2109, felt that 1 had shown his true colours when he'd bragged about being able to control humans, and so they'd shunned him. And in the end, as we know, 1 disappeared after 2109 had contacted him, pushed him out of the time conflation, and dismissed him as being completely irrelevant. From the experiment's point of view, just another aberration, like the poltergeists. Well, at least that's how things seem. But, as we'll see in the next and final episode about the meaning of the Dodleston mysteries, there may be more to 1 than meets the eye. And finally, who or what is 2109? Early in the story, 2109 had said,
"We are many, but no more than one in the time to come."
So, as we've already figured out, 2109 appears to be more than one entity, either representing a group of them, or, more likely from the clues, 2109 is a collective of entities. Star Trek's Borg, in effect, though thankfully with slightly better manners. And that message continued, describing the collective as
Movement that casts no shadows, thought without chemical reaction.
so seemingly an entity without physical substance. 2109 is obviously in control of the whole situation, since it was 2109
Who did bring the box of lights?
the computer to Lukas. 2109 appears not only to be in charge, but also capable of controlling the situation, including the actions of the protagonists. So, moving the floppy disk from the windowsill to encourage them to continue messaging each other, in other words, to continue with the experiment. Conveying a very frightened Lukas to see Debbie. Actually controlling Lukas, perhaps, which is possibly why he was not quite what he seems to be, rather like his messages, as we saw in the previous episode. And talking of the messages, writing in chalk in Meadow Cottage's kitchen, including writing out that threat in Latin from Lukas's friend, altering or faking Lukas's messages on the Beeb, and very significantly controlling how all the medieval messages were expressed, the language that was used. Actually, it's just struck me that we have concrete evidence of that. Occasionally, 2109 would write in Middle English to Lukas, and those messages were identical in style to Lukas's, with the same mix of sophistication and rubbish, showing clearly that there's a single intelligence behind all the messages, and a giveaway that it was 2109. And now a few extra and rather curious thoughts about 2109.
You said your time is 1985. I thought you were also from 2109, like your friend, who did bring the box of lights.
Initially, Lukas had led us to believe that 2109 was an entity from the year 2109. But as the story progressed, this seemed not to be the case. And, as we found out, the collective's name wasn't actually 2109.
How can we have a name?
So what's the significance of that number? In his account, Ken wonders if the number 2109 is actually a cipher, a secret code of some sort. And I think he's right. And we appear to have cracked it, based on our observation that there are many references and allusions to the Christian Bible in Ken's book. As you probably know, the number 144 or 144,000 has great significance in Western culture, as here in the Old Testament book of Revelation. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. And if we subtract 144 from 2109, we get the number 1955, 1955. And that was the year that Ken Webster was born. So if Ken's book is just fiction, then the number 2109 could be thought of as a cryptic autograph. But if it's not fiction, as seems to be the case, then it could be seen as a revelation designed by the collective to show its connection to Ken, a kind of numerological link, as it were. But that's not all. This cipher, this conundrum, goes far deeper. It actually encapsulates the raison d'etre of the Dodleston mysteries, which we'll explore in detail in the final episode, The Meaning. And finally, as regards 2109, you remember at the beginning of the story those footprints on the walls with 6 toes? And that later 2109 had said,
As long as your kind cannot penetrate our world, we are safe.
Penetrate our world? So is the collective closer than we think? Just below our feet, perhaps? I'm sure you've heard of the hollow earth theory, which proposes that there's a subterranean world below the surface of our planet, a belief that goes back at least as far as the ancient Greeks. And, according to some researchers, the entities there are descended from the 6-toed humans of the Golden Age, who have enlightened understanding and travel using portals. Portals assisting Lukas's visits, perhaps. Yes, highly speculative, I agree. But why else would the 6-toed footprints have been mentioned at the very beginning of the book? Anyway, in conclusion, 2109, an entity, either an enhanced humanoid from the future, seemingly without a body, an artificial intelligence entity perhaps, or a paranormal entity beyond material existence, or even an extraterrestrial. Any of these, capable of not only connecting times through tachyonic technology perhaps, but also of affecting the people there, mentally through a powerful form of telepathy, and perhaps physically by projecting them through metaphysical portals, with the bonus of collecting first-hand observations about its experiment by getting Lukas in the past and Ken in the present to write up lab notes for the collective in those all-important books, in effect written up by the guinea pigs themselves, the specimens who'd actually experienced the experiment. rather like asking bacteria in a petri dish to write down how they feel after they've been dosed with a prototype antibiotic. Valuable feedback for experimenters. But before we finish, we should consider one other thought. 2109 seemed very knowledgeable about UFOs and how, as it said, when in an earthly area of convectional magnetism, their passengers could be projected through time and space onto or into an existing human, a kind of literal transubstantiation. Was this a hint that 2109 and 1 were actually extraterrestrials? But, extraterrestrial or not, 2109 seemed very curious about humanity, its behaviour, its strengths and weaknesses, its perceptiveness, and interested in testing humanity's ability to read between the lines, in effect the literal meaning of the word intelligence. Intelligence. Is this why 2109 was testing the 1980s folk with its manipulated messages? Figuring out how intelligent they were? Were they bright enough to spot the inconsistencies, the clues? Or is it our intelligence that the collective is really testing when we read that all-important book? But why might it be testing us? And this is the main question we'll be asking and answering with the help of that 2109 cipher, in the meaning, the final part of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full story. We're coming to the end now of our investigation. We've followed the story, we've looked closely at the messages and their curious mixture of rubbish and sophistication, that IQ testing game that 2109 appeared to be playing with its manipulated messages. We've weighed up the possibility of hoaxes, either from Ken, Debbie and Peter, or from paranormal entities. And now let's put all those pieces together, along with a few other rather intriguing revelations, and see that full picture. Our final questions are, was 2109 running some kind of experiment with time manipulation, and getting Lukas in the past and Ken in the present to report back on it in their books? An experiment that appeared to be going wrong. And was 2109 reaching out to us for some special purpose? A purpose that is hidden in plain sight, in that cipher, that conundrum, that until now no one else seems to have cracked. So let's turn our attention first to that experiment. 2109 had talked about tachyons, those hypothesized faster-than-light particles that, if the conditions are right, could transport matter across time. So are we actually witnessing an experiment with time? If so, we could dismiss any ideas that we might have that Lukas and his friends were just spirits of the deceased, engaged in some kind of electronic séance, but were, synchronously, in their time as alive as Ken, Debbie and Peter were in theirs, which would explain how 2109, through its experiment, had been able to warn them in that very first message about Lukas's eventual arrest and the sheriff's, or pussycat's, need to go to London to save him. A warning at the very beginning of the connection, months before the arrest and Lukas's release actually happened. 2109, the clairvoyant, seeing clearly through the whole of time. And this experiment was obviously really important to 2109, who was concerned that if they continued to
disrupt our experiments,
the conservation of reality could be threatened. How could this be? Dave Welch and John Bucknell from SPR had said, back in July 85, that our traditional view of time, a continuum like a horizontal arrow, was incorrect, that time is actually vertical, with all times layered in a vertical plane. In a sense, all times happening at the same time, but experienced or perceived by us humans as changing minute by minute. Indeed, Albert Einstein himself had said,
"The distinction between the past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion."
That we live in an ever-changing now, which only feels linear because we humans experience the universe through our linear thought processes. But of course, that is how things are meant to be. And with 2109 introducing vertical time to humans, who are supposed only to exist and operate in horizontal time, the collective had actually endangered reality. We humans are simply not meant to experience vertical time directly. It's the ultimate irony, because 2109 had warned Ken and the others that
knowledge will be your progress, but your kind are coming close to getting their fingers burnt.
In other words, we humans don't have the wisdom to use our advancing knowledge safely. And that's exactly what 2109 was doing. With its advancing knowledge, the experiment with time, the collective was actually reaching too high, getting its fingers burnt. And it simply didn't have the wisdom to realize that the experiment posed an enormous danger to reality. An experiment using new technology that was unreliable and difficult to control.
We are not entirely in command of this experiment,
as 2109 had admitted, and indicated when Lukas had once complained that there was, as he said,
little power,
so that he, or 2109, through Lukas, couldn't communicate. Indeed, according to 2109, its experiment was so fragile that even by their finding out Lukas's real name, everything that Ken, Debbie and Peter had experienced could disappear from reality. And as part of the experiment, although the collective had wanted Ken and the others to connect with Lukas, it now realized that by their getting too involved, things were going wrong. From silence, a storm was approaching, a storm triggered by humans changing the past, as Ken and the others had done when they'd manipulated the sheriff into saving Lukas's life by threatening to damn his soul forever if he didn't release Lukas. Or getting others involved, as they had with SPR. Both of these actions threatening the stability of true time, vertical time, undermining it, destabilizing it by altering it. As you know, when we talk about time travel, the problem of the grandfather paradox always comes up. That if by the actions of a time traveller their grandfather had never met their grandmother, then they themselves would not have existed to have gone back in time. And 2109, in its arrogant foolhardiness, had unleashed this paradox, turning it into an existential threat. Hubris leading to nemesis, overestimating one's abilities, leading to negative consequences. Perhaps to preserve reality, Lukas was actually meant to die. Indeed, the collective had started to panic when it saw things were going wrong. In a very extreme reaction, it had smashed the disk drive to prevent them communicating, and said that it needed to let things cool down. So 2109 wasn't as wise as it thought, and had brought on the storm itself by mistaking its knowledge for wisdom, the very thing that it accuses us humans of doing. And it wasn't just humans destabilizing the time matrix.
It is correct for you to assume that the poltergeist phenomena is present in the communications.
2109 had said that the poltergeist shouldn't have been there, set free in time to mess around in the present and the past. Indeed, Dave Welsh from SPR had suggested this. Paranormal entities moving at will between the layers, or even existing synchronously through all of them, and thereby, more ominously, influencing and potentially destabilizing reality. Had the poltergeist sneaked into the time conflation by some kind of metaphysical osmosis? Rather like with AM radio, you can be listening to a program, and other wavelengths, other radio broadcasts can creep in.
A worm is covered from top to toe with a sort of slimy substance, but not only that.
And 2109's lack of control of the experiment is shown when it said that it could only try to do something about the poltergeists, unsure of how to stop or get rid of them, and becoming more and more alarmed. And this is when I'd like to return, as promised, to the entity 1. 1 tends to get a very bad press. I've read or watched just about every review of the Dodleston mysteries. 2109 always comes out as basically the good guy, and 1's often painted as the baddie, the interfering troublemaker. But in the same way that I've shown 2109 to be far from perfect, because we now have the full picture, we can see that one, despite his faults, was genuinely trying to alert Ken and his friends to the dangers. He said that 2109 was actually messing around with something dangerous and uncontrollable, unleashing forces that could potentially destabilize reality, and had warned them to avoid any further involvement. He even said to Lukas that he'd brought those troubles on himself by getting involved. It's even possible that, as 2109 had suggested, Nick Sowerby Johnson may actually have been a projection, an embodiment of one, desperately trying to persuade them here on Earth to shut down their involvement with 2109 and thereby safeguard reality. No wonder that 2109 wanted one out of the way. As we've probably all experienced in our lives, arrogant folk don't like to be proved wrong. So in a way, by seeing the full picture, not just the pieces, we've spotted a reversal of how 2109 and 1 are usually thought of. But just to clarify, I'm not saying that 2109 is a baddie, not at all. Just rather human in a way, a mix of qualities and not always following his own good advice. Anyway, before I draw my final conclusions, I'd just like to mention something seemingly inconsequential. The colour green. An important and significant colour throughout human history. Green was sacred to the ancient Egyptians, who often painted their temple floors green. This belief spread to Persia, where green was, and still is, seen as a sacred colour. And more relevant to our investigation, green is seen by mystics as a bridge builder between everyday reality and the unseen world, the paranormal. And on that subject, you'll recall that when 2109 was explaining the subject of time, it said that when a UFO crosses an area of convectual magnetism, a green mist forms around the vessel as the extraterrestrial occupant is transported across time and space. Indeed, the colour green keeps coming up in the story when there's any indication of time manipulation or a paranormal connection bridging our world with something metaphysical. So, when Debbie saw Lukas in the living room with her, he'd appeared from a white light that turned an incandescent green. And Lukas had said that he'd been visited by a very arrogant man called One, a time traveller whose shadow glowed an incandescent green. And later, when Lukas was about to receive the computer from 2109, he'd seen a green light coming from the walls of his chimney before the entity had stepped out from it.
I saw a green light issuing from the walls of my chimney, and from this light stepped what I thought was the devil himself.
And is it just a coincidence that their BBC Micro had a monochrome green monitor, the very focus of all these goings-on? Well, it's certainly a thought. So is a green glow or mist known to be associated with time distortions? Certainly Steve Meara thinks so.
In my research, I've come across many examples of a green glow, which are often associated with paranormal phenomena.
And it was this phenomenon that first attracted me to the Dodleston mysteries. As a young chap in the mid-80s, I'd felt a curious impulse to visit the house where I'd lived as a child. Looking up at the door of my old bedroom at the top of the stairs, I felt strangely drawn towards it. And, as I ascended, I remembered how the bedroom used to be, with my favourite bed cover and its distinctive astronomy design, and a Leonardo da Vinci helicopter poster on one of the walls. But as I approached, my heart started to pound. Why was I so nervous? Slowly I opened the door. The new owners had converted my old bedroom into a home office, complete with an Apple Mac Plus, the main rival to the BBC Micro. Then gradually the room began to glow green. A mist swirled round, and through it I saw my old bedroom, exactly as it used to be. And then the past passed, and the room returned to the present. And although I didn't know it then, This was at exactly the same time as only about 10 miles away, Ken, Debbie and Peter were having similar experiences, particularly Debbie, when she was visited by Lukas. Coincidence? Or possibly it was some kind of time distortion leak, a distortion spillage, as it were, associated with the unstable experiment. Anyway, the frequent references to the colour green would seem to support the notion of time being manipulated by 2109. So what do we make of this mystery in Dodleston and the strange goings-on there, in the past, the present and possibly the future? Are the bits of the puzzle forming a full and clear picture? Actually, I think we have, in the words of 2109, two choices. Either paranormal entities, poltergeists perhaps, just messing around, though the story does feel too complex and sustained for that. According to Colin Wilson and Steve Meara, poltergeists have notoriously short attention spans before they go off to find their next easy victims. Or the other possibility, an entity, paranormal or extraterrestrial, possibly a genetically or AI-enhanced humanoid from the future, or indeed existing outside of time. An entity that's running a very early and very unstable experiment with time manipulation, with the BBC Micro Model B computer acting as a bridge between the paranormal and the physical worlds. Personally, after having studied Ken's book intensely for over a year, I feel it's more likely to be that. And for me, that's underlined by the way that SPR and the ufologist Gary Rowe backed off. Was what was actually going on far too hot to handle? Indicated by the way that, according to Ken's account, SPR had lied to the Chester Observer newspaper about their questions not being answered, when originally they'd said that they had been partially answered. And if Nick, supposedly a member of the Society for Psychical Research, was actually a manifestation of one, as suggested by 2109, that might explain why SPR had said that they'd never heard of him. I'll finish now with something relevant to us. In a way, I think, at the very heart of the Dodleston mysteries. 2109 may not have been as wise as it thought, but its motive was noble. It said that, through the experiment, it was offering guidance to the modern world through those communications with Ken, Debbie and Peter. What guidance? Well, first, that there is a difference between human knowledge and human wisdom, warning us that we are advancing, particularly in science, but not always wisely.
It is better to have no knowledge at all than to have a distorted view of the truth because of your lack of understanding.
Think of the genius Albert Einstein urging Roosevelt to build the bomb, and then, after the devastation, recorded as saying, "Woe is me," regretting his lack of wisdom of the horrors that he'd naively helped to bring to an unstable world. And second,
I think if your government does take and use my strange device for themselves, then it would become their play box. It is essential that your government does not take our computer.
Warnings through Lukas about the danger of governments using computers to control their people. Something that's actually happening today. Whether using artificial intelligence for genetic manipulation, creating enhanced humans, but just for the rich and powerful, of course, or developing sniffer bioweapons that can target individuals thanks to the accelerating collection of personalized DNA readings, or surveillance using cell or mobile phone tracking and the like, including using surveillance for the prediction of potential criminal behavior. Public CCTV, for example, is being digitized to track criminals using AI-driven facial recognition and with wide public support. But would the public be quite so happy to know that it also tracks other citizens, you and me, who innocently and inadvertently interact with those criminals, as in this clip, perhaps simply by asking them for directions, and then marked as persons of interest, possible associates of criminals? And where do the authorities find most of these photos for facial recognition? Social media, where people willingly give them all the information they want, a treasure trove to be plundered and used for the public benefit, keeping a big brotherly eye on all of us, keeping us safe. All of these are warnings that really we should heed. And maybe that's why 2109 had said that Ken, Debbie and Peter
have a purpose that shall, in your lifetime, change the face of history.
Have a purpose, writing the book to warn us. And that, as 2109 concluded,
knowledge will be your progress, but your kind are coming close to getting their fingers burnt. Indirectly, you may prevent this. Get out your bricks. Get ready to build. Write the book.
So now we know what "get out your bricks" actually meant in that very first message. Not Lukas saying, "Get out of my stolen house," but 2109 saying, "Ken, help to build a better future. Write the book, spread the message." And who was this message for? Through Lukas, 2109 had already started testing Ken, Debbie and Peter to see how perceptive they were. You'll recall that Lukas supposedly had asked why they hadn't spotted his errors. Think of it as 2109 asking them through Lukas. Were they going to be bright enough to heed its warnings? A paranormal IQ test for Homo sapiens sapiens. Or is 2109 using Ken's all-important book to test whether its readers are bright enough to heed the collective's warnings? We know the collective had the power to alter text coming from Lukas, text that was, frankly, linguistic rubbish, sprinkled with tantalizing tidbits of sophistication. Did the collective want it in the book to see if any of us spotted it? And did it think that, with the challenges humanity faces, such perceptive people would be the very ones to try and sort out these problems, and thus rescue the world and humanity from a potentially perilous future? Was the collective fishing for the likes of you and me to offer us this guidance? And as promised, here's the deeper relevance of that cipher beyond the symbolic numerological connection with Ken. Actually, this is a very complex topic that deserves a full investigation itself, but highly simplified and focusing only on the main points. In addition to the concept of theosophy and angel numbers, it relates to Mayan and Native American prophecies. That 144,000 enlightened masters, as a collective, will communicate with us one day, with the number 144 signifying their mission, which is to encourage humanity to embrace reason and wisdom, and thus liberate it from a dark and manipulated future imposed by those obsessed with controlling us. And the purpose of this prophesied collective? To reach out to us with guidance. Remember that Ken, the author's birth date, is 1955. So Ken, 1955, guidance, 144. Add them together, 2109, the bringer of guidance for humanity through Ken's book. And regardless of whether one believes in such prophecies or not, Ken, conveying 2109's guidance for humanity, does appear to be the intended meaning of the cipher 2109. And with that, we've come to the end of our investigation. The pieces of the jigsaw puzzle have come together, the characters from the past and present, and the reasons why they were chosen by the entity from possibly the future, the messages with their strange but revealing mixture of rubbish and sophistication, and the unstable time experiment. And all these pieces now assembled into a full and illuminating picture. The vertical plane appears not to be a hoax by Ken Webster, Debbie Oakes and Peter Trinder. Rather, it carries a message that's important, particularly to our present times, advising us, indeed warning us, to resist making existential mistakes that could threaten our future, the future of humanity. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts. You may have spotted clues I've missed. And if so, or if you have any other ideas, please do leave comments down below. I'd be delighted to read them. Actually, we could produce some follow-up investigations based on them. And I'll put a link to Ken's excellent book in the description. Though I have revealed the full picture, the main storyline and its meaning, there are some curious subplots that are certainly entertaining, including ones about Lukas's possible girlfriend, Catherine. Anyway, thank you sincerely for watching. I do hope you found this unusual story as intriguing as I did, and that you enjoyed a bit of detective work. And if you did, would you kindly share with friends who enjoy a good mystery, and, if you have a moment, pop over to my own channel, Louis Sinclair Investigates, and subscribe, so you'll be able to see when the next investigation is posted. Thank you. Anyway, I hope that in the future, or perhaps in the past, we'll meet again for another Louis Sinclair Investigates. Thank you again, and, as they said in the Middle Ages, farewell. I hope you fare well. Cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.